In this week's YouTube video, we're going to look at how do you actually value a business? And specifically, as a product leader, how should you think about that? And to do this well, we have to first ask ourselves the following question. How do the shareholders in the company that you're leading product for extract their value for the investment and the equity that they have in your business? And in general, there are multiple different ways that you could do this. You could do this by, distributions of the profits from the business, and you could also do this by selling either some or all of the equity. For most of today's video, we're going to really focus on the second of those, the selling some or all of the equity. And to do this, then we need to ask ourselves this very basic question. Well, what's a company worth? Right? And this is the kind of thing that plenty of PhDs have been given in the finance departments at business schools across the country answering this question with wonderful academic answers like, well, here's how you apply different discounts to future cash flows, apply them to the present value, and say this is what a company's worth. And ultimately, I'm not here to give all those business school professors a hard time, but the reality is, the real answer is a business is worth what the buyer will pay. And this is why it's important as an entrepreneur and an executive to think about great companies are bought, not sold, because when you're putting the impetus on the buyer to offer a good price, that changes the dynamic dramatically. And you can even think about this in the case of publicly traded companies, right? This is sort of where buyers and sellers meet. That's what the stock price is worth. So there's a number of things that can influence the value. Usually at the high level, it's either a multiple of EBITDA or a multiple of revenue. But as you know, there are premiums placed on businesses that are growing one or both of those numbers incredibly quickly. And then there are some times where you have to use a proxy for revenue or EBITDA. One of the obviously famous examples over the last couple of decades was Instagram, well before Instagram ever made any money, selling to Facebook, because Facebook and Instagram both knew engaged mobile users were worth a lot of money, even though they hadn't turned that on yet. And so they were using a proxy for that valuation. There are also other influences. There's competition for the deal, overall what's going on in the economy, and whether this taps into certain technology trends. So a couple of years ago, that might have been crypto. Today, that might be lots of interest in these trends around artificial intelligence. But the point is, there are things that can either drive premiums or decrease the value based on some of these other influences. But the real question for you as a product leader is, when you think about these influences on valuation, how does the product that you're leading connect to these valuation metrics? And now we get back to some of the stuff we talked about in the earlier videos. And if you haven't watched those, I'd encourage you to go back and watch some of the earlier videos in this series where we talk about things like unit economics, like revenue models, things like that, because not all revenue and not all customers are created equally. And so you as a product leader, as you're thinking about how you can either drive up the valuation or do some things to reduce some taxes or burdens on the valuation, right? You can think about, how do I change the gross margins? How do I increase the predictability of my revenue? How do I avoid too much revenue or customer concentration? How do I make sure that it's sustainable revenue models that I have, right? And so you can think about the projects you're doing and think about how they can drive these premiums or eliminate some of the taxes that might come on the valuation. And then the last piece of this is, you also need to kind of understand in general, well, what is an increase in revenue worth, or what is an increase in profit worth? And ultimately, the challenging part about this is it's going to change based on what's going on in the macro environment. So to use software as a service revenue as an example again, you can look over the last few years and see how multiples on annualized recurring revenue for publicly traded companies have evolved significantly. This is work that came out from SaaS Capital, and it's not so much about the specific numbers so much as you can see here, the multiples place vary quite significantly across the range of time that we're talking about here over the last few years. And so selling at the peak versus selling at a valley is going to dramatically change things. But the more relevant point is that in general, you see the trend line being up, that recurring revenue becomes more and more valuable over a longer time horizon. And so with that, then you can kind of understand those averages and think about these levers you're playing with for the products that you're responsible for leading. And ultimately, as a product leader now here, tie these questions back to the work you're doing and how it influences overall valuation.